day to put service above self for projects large and small. Our community is stronger, fairer, and our community is better. For that, you deserve our thanks. We know that we're fortunate to live in this community, but what about our broader community? World affairs and world awareness is the theme that you've asked me to discuss today. It's an appropriate theme, and I think it's very appropriate for an organization that puts service above self. After all, if governments and institutions around the world would more frequently put service above self, following in the example of Rotary International, the condition of world affairs would no doubt improve dramatically. Likewise, world awareness would no doubt be enhanced. Today's theme also matches Rotary International's fourth guiding principle, which is the advancement of international understanding, goodwill, and peace through a world fellowship of business and professional persons united in the ideal of service. I've always felt that the members of this organization, this club in particular, are the pillars of the Fergus and Elora community. And as an MPP, I consider my role to be one, first and foremost, of service to my community. Just as importantly, it means trying to determine, to the very best of my ability, what is in the public interest of the province as a whole. And while I've occasionally met elected officials from other countries, the role of an MPP only rarely requires international involvement. Foreign affairs, after all, is the responsibility and the purview of the Government of Canada. That means federal members of Parliament may need an up-to-date passport for what they have to do. But as for us members of provincial Parliament, well, let's say for MPPs, having a passport is not necessarily a job requirement. In fact, I was once asked what the trips were like for MPPs. I said yes. Being an MPP does require extensive travel. In fact, I do travel quite a lot to exotic places like Clifford, Harriston, and around the riding. And in our own home, Lisa and I are savers, not spenders. We do have enjoyed some travel through the years, but my travel experiences to date have been more limited than you might expect. In the past 20 years, though, I have been to Britain twice, to Washington, D.C. twice, and to New York City once. But I really have no vast international perspective to draw upon today based on extensive international travel. But at the same time, I can draw upon my long-held interest in the opportunities and challenges facing our world. While studying at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo in the 1980s, I was very interested in Canada's international relations, and for a time I even aspired to serve in Canada's Foreign Service. And although my life took a different path, I continue to read and continue to follow current events around the world with a lot of interest. Like many in public service, I have a considerable appetite for the news. And I think it's always a good idea to read news and opinion from a variety of sources, even those with which we might disagree. I believe in lifelong learning, especially on matters of importance to the world around us. And I'd like to share with you one example. Just last week I read an article in the Globe and Mail about an influential scholar named Joseph Nye. Some of you may have seen it. Joseph Nye is a former senior State Department and Pentagon official. And Nye had some lessons for Canada and how it can best build and use its influence in the world. He advocates the use of so-called soft power as well as hard power. Soft power, explains Nye, is the ability to get what you want by attraction and persuasion. Any Canadian government, he says, should want to use this method. And I think that's traditionally been the means by which Canadian diplomacy has been exhibited. Soft power has been called a narrative that confers legitimacy, such as respect for democracy, influence in institutions, or networks of countries or people, nudging them to compromise or share your goals. Hard power, on the other hand, can compel nations to do what they don't want to do. And military force is the most obvious example of hard power. Too often in history, hard power has been necessary to help prevent great injustices or the loss of life. Today, hard power is necessary to provide security and rebuild Afghanistan, and we're so proud of our Canadian forces for the work that they're doing there today. I agree with Nye that Canada has to be smart about how it uses its power abroad, hard and soft. I agree that Canada can, and indeed that we must, play a meaningful role in world affairs. Our country has a great deal to contribute, and we have the capacity to effect positive change all around the world. In recent years in particular, one of Canada's most important contributions has been our knowledge and experience in economic affairs and in the financial sector. Canada may not have made all the right economic moves all the time, but on the whole, we as a nation have weathered the global economic storm much better than most of our Western counterparts. For this, we can be very proud. That's why when governments and global financial regulators responded to the economic crisis, Canada had a seat at the table. And because of our successes, we have good reason to be there in the future and to offer our best advice. As your provincial representative, I've tried to offer my own advice to the government, and I've tried to do so constructively and frequently in a nonpartisan way. Ontario's economy has suffered in recent years. For a long time, even before our current global economic challenge, I've been concerned about our province's lack of a long-term strategy for economic competitiveness, something I believe we need given the rapidly changing world in which we live and the rapidly evolving global economy. As early as 2005, so 6 years ago, working with Perrin Beattie, who at the time was president of the Canadian Manufacturers Association, I brought forward a resolution in the Ontario Legislature calling for the All-Party Finance and Economic Affairs Committee to hold public hearings and develop an action plan to strengthen our manufacturing sector and save jobs. In 2006 and 2007, I continued to call for an action plan to deal with economic competitiveness and the loss of manufacturing jobs affecting so many communities across Ontario, including our own. And you'll recall that we began to lose economic opportunity and manufacturing jobs even before the Wall Street financial crisis and meltdown in 2008 and the Great Recession that followed it. And we're still feeling the effects of that. Again and again, I called upon the Finance Committee to address the specific economic challenges facing our manufacturing sector. Even though my resolution was passed in the House, the government has yet to follow up. But perhaps if the government had actually done the hearings that I was calling for, paid attention, and initiated a plan of action in response, we could have perhaps saved some of the jobs that were lost. And even though the legislature isn't presently in session, although we resume sitting on February the 22nd, the All-Party Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs has been quite busy over the winter recess. Recently I joined the committee and participated in some of the pre-budget consultations which were being held at Queen's Park. It's a chance for the committee to hear the ideas and suggestions of various people and groups from across the province. The committee then attempts to achieve consensus on the most important priorities facing the province, and then write and submit a report to the Minister of Finance. That report is intended to contain the priorities based on the hearings that should be included in the upcoming provincial budget, and this year we expect the budget to be most likely at the end of March. One of the groups appearing at the hearings was the CME, which is Canada's Manufacturers and Exporters. You'll be interested to know, I think, that Jay Myers, who grew up in Fergus, and who many of you will know, is now heading up that organization. I'm always glad to work with Jay. He's an outstanding business leader in the province of Ontario. Their organization called on the government to take action to ensure that the overall business environment is favorable and sufficiently competitive to retain and grow manufacturing investment in Ontario, and I couldn't agree more. But there's another aspect of manufacturing exports and international trade more generally that is positive for Canadians. International trade creates prosperity and creates jobs for our neighbors in our community. Our prosperity at home depends upon our economic relationships with the rest of the world. We know that Canada is not an island. We are a trading nation, and we've been a trading nation for some 400 years, ever since that first boat of codfish or the first load of furs left Canada for Europe. We are a trading nation, and that, I believe, is one of our greatest strengths. Trade produces economic benefits, and of course, but it's more than that. In many cases, trade helps to facilitate international awareness. The world is enriched not only when we trade our resources and commodities, but also when we trade our ideas and our ideals. For that, we need strong interpersonal relationships reaching across borders. In that respect, Canada stands in an enviable position. Because of our immigration policies through the years, which have brought millions to our shores over the last number of decades, we already have well-established relationships between our nation and so many others. Looking to the next 40 years, our economic future will be brighter because of these relationships. By comparison, other nations that have followed perhaps less welcoming immigration policies, will be less likely to seize the opportunities of the future. In the end, however, Government policies mean very little without people willing to take advantage of them and reach out to the rest of the world. Of course, you know that Rotary is at the forefront of building relationships through its global service projects. You should be very proud of these projects. And in doing so, Canadians of all ages are traveling, studying, working, and serving abroad. They are forming relationships for today and the future, which will help us build our country going forward. But of course, we can also learn from the experiences of others. At the same time, I assert that Canada is the greatest source of good in the international community today. And as Canadians, we can all take pride of this indisputable fact. We know we're a source of good, and that's why we should look to the future with anticipation, believing that tomorrow can and will be better than today. Let's embrace that kind of future. Let's embrace its promise for peace, prosperity, and harmony for generations to come. Thank you again for having me here today, and thank you for the work that you do in our community.